Good morning. So today we're starting in on Unit 4. Unit 4 is my favorite unit, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And so we're going to start with a very brief, and I do mean to keep this brief, overview of the Bill of Rights, and then we will cover the 14th Amendment as well, because those are the amendments most significant to civil rights and civil liberties. So, excuse me, the First Amendment, hopefully most of you know this one, but the First Amendment protects a variety of issues. So there's actually 5 different freedoms that we have under the First Amendment. We have freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, and freedom of the press. There's a little acronym that you see on there, RAPS, that sometimes helps people. But we're going to go through each of these sort of individually. Freedom of speech, hopefully you're aware of what that means. You are allowed to speak your mind. However, speech is a really good place to start because you need to understand that your rights are not absolute. What that means is that your rights are not without limitation. The typical example of this over the years has been the inability to yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not free speech. If you incite a panic and people are harmed, you can be held liable for that behavior. The second one we'll cover is freedom of religion, arguably the second most important of the First Amendment provisions. But freedom of religion is significant in the fact that there's a duality to freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is both freedom for you to practice whatever religion it is you wish to practice, but also freedom to ensure that the government will not establish an official religion, right? Now, what that means is you can practice your religion however you wish to practice it. And theoretically, you could have freedom of religion in a country like the Vatican. Right? So like the Vatican, you wouldn't necessarily have to be Catholic to live in the Vatican. But obviously it's a Catholic country. The Vatican is where the Pope lives. The Pope is the head of the Vatican. Right, but if you wanted to practice your religion and not go to confession, you know what I mean, or not Catholics don't eat they don't eat meat on Fridays during Lent, right? Like if you decided you lived in the Vatican that, you know what, I want a steak and it's Friday, it's Friday before Easter, or it's a Friday during Lent, I'm gonna eat a steak, you can still do that. In the United States, you can practice whatever religion you want. With again some exceptions. So you do need to understand there are limitations on your practice of religion as well. Now, some of that seems like obvious, right? Like you can't decide that you want to be a part of the Aztec religion and sacrifice human beings. Obviously, that's not acceptable. That's called murder. But there are also other limitations, right? So if you take fundamentalist Mormonism, for example, and some of these people still exist within the Mormon religion, although they're a very small percentage of Mormons today, but they believe in a concept of polygamy. That's actually a very common practice in sort of ancient religion. Judaism had polygamy, Islam has polygamy. There are a number of religions that allow that, yet the United States government has forbidden it. And so there's some limitations to your free exercise of religion as well. And this is something that has become increasingly important in the United States today, because we've seen all sorts of issues over where your sort of practice of religion ends and where sort of law begins, or your infringement upon other people's rights begin, right? We'll certainly talk about like the baker in Colorado that refused to make the gay wedding cake and claimed freedom of religion. We'll talk about Hobby Lobby and their unwillingness to provide birth control for their female employees because they felt that it violated their free exercise of religion. So it's a very complex issue. Okay? Freedom of assembly, right? That means that you can get together. Now, again, this can be regulated by the government. And freedom of assembly, regulation for freedom of assembly, basically just means that the government, like if you wanted to have a little protest and march down 762 here because you didn't like the school lunches, right? How very white of you, right? But if you wanted to hold your little protest because you didn't like the school lunches, and you would absolutely be allowed to do that. However, the city could absolutely refuse to allow you to do it on a Thursday at 3:40 in the afternoon because it wouldn't be safe. You would be blocking traffic. You would be preventing school buses from going home. You'd be doing all manner of things that the city would find objectionable. Right now, if you wanted to have your little protest at 10:30 on a Saturday morning, absolutely, you can do that. Okay? But because the city can regulate it, the city can still require you to get permits. The city can also require you to pay for the police officers that it would take to reroute traffic. Okay? Freedom of the press. Freedom of the press just means that we have a free press that is allowed to print what they want. And that's sort of essential to a democracy because, and we've talked about this before, in order for this country to function appropriately, you need to have a well-educated electorate. That's part of the problem that we've gotten ourselves into in this point, right, is the collective stupidity of America has become problematic, and which is why we don't really end up with good candidates on either side of the ballot anymore. It's why we have laws that make absolutely no sense. It's why we're reactionary to a wide variety of things. The press is meant in order to help. And then lastly on this is freedom to petition the government. This means that you're allowed and you cannot be stopped from writing your congressman or your president or whomever within your government and asking them to do things for you. Doesn't mean that they have to do them, right? The Obama administration is a really good example of this because they actually set up a website. Obviously, like technological advancements, makes sense. They set up a website, right? And I think it was just whitehouse.gov. And you could put a petition on there. Okay, so for instance, in 2008, when Barack Obama was reelected, there was a petition actually from all 50 states that said, we want to secede from the union, right? Because they didn't like the reelection of Barack Obama. The state of Texas actually met the requirement. So the requirement, it was self-determined, right? But the Obama administration basically said, you get 100,000 signatures, 100,000 signatures on your petition, and we will address it, right? Texas, as I'm sure you can imagine, got more than 100,000 signatures on a petition to secede from the union upon the re-election of Barack Obama. I'm sure you can also guess what Obama said. No, you can't leave. Fun little side note. When it became apparent that Texas was going to get those 100,000 signatures, the city of Austin started its own petition that said if Texas gets out, we want to stay in, which would have been really comical to me. But again, just because you can petition the government doesn't mean the government has to give you what you want. Second Amendment. This one's in the news a lot as well. This one's talked about a lot. You have the right to bear arms. Arms is a very loosely defined term. In fact, you probably learned in a U.S. history class about the nuclear arms race. So, if you have the right to bear arms and nuclear weapons are arms, do you have the right to own a nuke? No, you certainly do not have the right to own a nuclear weapon. There are limitations to your Second Amendment rights, and there absolutely can be limitations to your Second Amendment rights. Even Antonin Scalia, one of the most conservative justices, wrote that. Third Amendment. This is something that doesn't really show up, but if you study history, you sort of understand it, right? Like during the pre-Revolutionary War era, the British required the colonists to quarter soldiers, which means basically put them up. So basically a soldier can just come to your house, knock on the door and be like, hey, I need a bed and some dinner. So go get on that. And you have to do it. We made that an amendment to where it can't happen, right? Like it just can't. Fourth Amendment. I, to me, this is one of the absolutely essential amendments, because it creates something that doesn't really exist anywhere else, and so it becomes wildly important. But the Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable or unlawful searches and seizures. And those are two different things, searches or seizures. We will talk about both of them in depth as we get through this unit. We'll spend a significant amount of time on the Fourth Amendment because we'll talk about a concept. You'll see a video on a concept called civil forfeiture, and we'll also look at no-knock warrants and what those are and how those affect Americans. And but this is the closest thing that we have to your right to privacy. You should be protected in your possessions and your sort of home from intrusion of the government. And that's essentially what this is saying. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that they can't come in. Okay? They just have to have a warrant to do it. And a warrant requires, or should require, probable cause. Okay? That means that a warrant requires that you have enough information as the police. The police have gathered enough information to be able to go to a judge and say, hey, we want to go and search John Smith's house for these items that we will believe were committed in this crime, and here's the evidence that we have that John Smith was involved and that these were the items we're looking for. Then they can go in and they can search the house so long as a judge signs off on that warrant. The Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is another one like the First Amendment. We all know the Fifth Amendment as I plead the Fifth, right? Like you got caught, you was guilty, you're like, I don't want to incriminate myself, I'm gonna plead the Fifth. Okay, the Fifth Amendment is actually far more than that. The Fifth Amendment is actually very much like the First Amendment. There are actually a number of provisions. Some of those provisions are things like double jeopardy. And so take O.J. Simpson as a really good example. O.J. Simpson could come out today, and be like, you know what, dude? I killed Nicole Brown and that other dude that nobody remembers his name, right? But he'd be like, I killed my ex-wife and her friend. And you know what will happen to O.J. Simpson? Nothing. Nothing. He could admit it and he won't spend a single day in jail. Because double jeopardy says he cannot be tried twice for the same crime. He was tried for that and he was found to be not guilty. He cannot be tried again, even if he were to admit that he did it today. Okay? Now, because I've taught in some rough areas, and I did have a kid that thought, they were like, man, so you're telling me I can go rob a liquor store and then go to jail for like 3 years and then get out and I can just keep robbing the same liquor store and they can't ever arrest me again? No, those would be different crimes. Even if you went and robbed the same liquor store, they happened on different days, they are different crimes, and you would continue to be thrown in jail. Double jeopardy only applies to a singular event. And now you also need to be aware that double jeopardy is sort of problematic in this day and age, because you now have issues where we've had courts begin to sort of say, well, we have state law, like we remember federalism, right? Like we have state laws and then we have federal laws, right? And if you commit an act, any act, and that act violates state law and it violates federal law, theoretically you could get tried twice. Once by the state and once by the national government, okay? Which is probably a little problematic, but that's the concept of double jeopardy. Due process is in the Fifth Amendment. The eminent domain is in the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment involves more than just not incriminating yourself in a trial, okay? So we need to be aware of that. The Sixth Amendment, and this sort of piggybacks off the fifth, because the fifth is looking at once we get when we're talking about double jeopardy. I don't know why eminent domain is in there. It doesn't fit for me. If you don't know, sorry, we probably should have said this too. Eminent domain is where the government can basically come and take your property, like just take it. And when I say take it, they buy it. They buy it, but they force you to sell it. You might not want to sell your house. They force you to sell it. You don't have an option, right? That's eminent domain. But a lot of our Fifth Amendment protections are things like protections against double jeopardy, the right to due process, things of that nature. The Sixth Amendment is an extension of that, because the Sixth Amendment is also looking at sort of the provisions or the rights of the accused. Okay, so in the Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a speedy trial. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to confront witnesses against you. You have the right to have an impartial jury. You have the right to be brought before a judge and be told of the crime that you are accused of. These are all rights that the accused has in order to try to defend themselves, because we exist in a country, we should exist in a country. Sometimes this doesn't play out, especially in popular culture, but from the legal system, we exist in a country where you are innocent until proven guilty. Innocence is the default position, right? And that's sometimes problematic for us as a society, because when you look at, we'll use the Trayvon Martin case as an example, right? So George Zimmerman, I always get those two mixed up. Like, one is the dude that sells the suits, and one is the Hispanic dude from Florida that shot Trayvon Martin. Whichever one it is, George Zimmer, I think it's Zimmerman. I think Zimmerman is Florida. Anyway, so dude shoots Trayvon Martin, right? And he's like, well, no, self-defense. Like, he attacked me, he was punching me, self-defense, right? Here's the problem with the way laws are written in that regard. You can't convict George Zimmerman. Like, you just can't. Okay? Because innocent is the default position, and you can't prove that he's guilty, because it's literally his word against nobody's word, because the other party is dead. Okay? But we exist in a nation where the innocence is and should be, rightfully should be, the default position. The Seventh Amendment is a little bit of an extension of the Sixth. It just says that you can have a jury in civil suits, right? So we have criminal law and then we have civil law, right? And so civil law would be like you and I are neighbors, and there's a tree growing at the edge of like your property, right? And sort of branches are like coming over on my property. Let's say it's an orange tree, and I hate like the fruit that falls on my side of the fence, and then like it just mucks up my yard. I don't like it. I hate it. I hate it. Hate it. So I cut your tree down, right? Now you could take me to court and be like, you've defiled my property, and you owe me money for the damages to my house, right? That would be a civil case. And you have the right to a trial by jury in a civil case. My wife actually served on a civil jury in which a man was suing his church for basically for monetary compensation for some burns that he had received while doing some sort of like men cook charity thing. He apparently used a pressure cooker incorrectly, and the steam caused some burns, right? That's a civil case. The Eighth Amendment protects against cruel and unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual, not cruel or unusual, right? And there's a disconnect there, right? Because theoretically, if it's cruel but not unusual, might be okay. And sometimes that is the sort of justification for the death penalty. The death penalty is certainly cruel. You're ending a human life. However, death as a penalty for crimes is not unusual, nor has it ever been. You go back 100, 300 years ago, 200 years ago, death was the crime for all, or excuse me, was the punishment for all manner of crimes, right? Death was a common punishment, certainly not an unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment, so the first eight actually tell us basically what the United States government cannot do to us. All right. The Ninth Amendment is a necessary amendment because Madison and some of the other Federalists that didn't want a Bill of Rights in the First Amendment, in the Constitution to begin with, understood that once you begin to list, name, codify rights that we have in the United States, inevitably, you're going to leave one out. You're going to omit something, not out of malice, but because you simply cannot come up with an all-inclusive list, especially not for a document that is meant to last forever. Because there will be new rights, new issues that come about that the founders never thought of. And so the Ninth Amendment just says we have more rights than what are listed here. The 10th Amendment is our amendment for federalism. And it's our amendment for federalism. It says that everything not given to the national government, every power not given to the national government or explicitly denied to the state governments belongs to the states. To implement or to apply the 10th Amendment correctly, marriage should be a state issue, not a national issue. Education should be a state issue, not a national issue. Now, understand, education, for the most part, it is a state issue, right? In the state of Texas, for instance, they decided a couple of years ago, foolishly, that you only need 3 years of social studies in order to graduate, okay? In North Carolina, where I came from, ironically, the year that Texas switched and said you only needed 3 instead of 4, the state of Texas, or excuse me, the state of North Carolina, they did the opposite. It used to be 3, then they said, no, you actually need 4 years in order to graduate. Okay? And so there's a lot of autonomy for states when it comes to something like education. Now, when you look at marriage, okay, marriage, again, theoretically is a state issue, and there are aspects of marriage that are state issues, right? Some states have something called a common law marriage, right? Other states do not recognize common law marriages. Okay, in the state of Texas, because my wife and I looked it up just because we thought it would be funny. In the state of Texas, a common law marriage, the only requirements for a common law marriage are that you cohabitate, meaning if you like literally, let's just understand this, because you graduate from like college and then you have like a female roommate or a male roommate or a roommate of the opposite sex, or I guess theoretically, even a roommate of the same sex now. And then you make a joke about being married to somebody else. You say that y'all are married. Y'all are a married couple. Guess what? You just had a common law marriage in the state of Texas. That's all it took. All it takes is for you to live with somebody else, share a domicile or residence, and tell other people y'all married, and you're married. That's it. That's all it takes. Now, when you look at something like gay marriage comes into this next one. And that's the 14th Amendment. Because the 14th Amendment is, outside of the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment is definitively the most important amendment that we've added to the Constitution, because the 14th Amendment is our protection against discrimination and due process violations and equal protection violations for citizens in the United States, right? So when we say equal protection, and the 14th Amendment is going to be what allows for gay marriage nationally. It's going to overturn what the states say. A number of states have passed laws that said gay marriage is illegal. States like North Carolina had passed constitutional amendments to their state constitution, said marriage is between one man and one woman. The national government is going to come in and overturn this with Obergefell v. Hodges and the 14th Amendment, because the Equal Protection Clause says that you have to be treated equally under the law. So, what you don't know, because none of you are married, right, is that married couples actually have a significant number of legal provisions provided to them, right? So my wife and I are married. If I were to die today, right, my wife automatically gets custody of our children. My wife automatically gets possession of all of my things. Okay, that's automatic because we are married under the law. But if you said homosexuals cannot get married, then all of a sudden, let's just say that you had two women in a marriage. One of them got pregnant, right? They intentionally got pregnant. They wanted to raise some children together. One of them went and did like IVF or whatever, right? She gets pregnant, okay? She has biological children, children that are actually like genetically hers, right? Now her wife obviously shares no genetic material with these children, okay? And so genetic mom dies. Those children now basically get put in the care of the state 20, 30 years ago because the other mother doesn't have any legal rights. She doesn't get equal protection under the law. Okay? And so that's a key component here, right? That's going to be sort of the grounds for making gay marriage legal nationally. That's the reason behind the 14th Amendment. Because we want to make sure that blacks are treated the same as whites under the law. Okay? Due process. The due process amendment of the 14th, due process clause of the 14th Amendment is also a part of this, right? Whether or not discrimination can be legal. And the answer is yes, right? The government has said they're allowed to discriminate. If you don't believe me, I just want you to raise your hand if you're old enough to drink alcohol. Legally. Put your hand down. I said illegally. Okay? So that is age-based discrimination, isn't it? Oh, you didn't even think about it. Man, the government discriminating against you because you can't have a beer. Right? But the government has proven that that age-based discrimination is actually necessary. There's just cause for it. Okay? And the 14th Amendment says so long as we go through due process and the government shows cause. And the cause is, just so you all understand, the cause is that your liver, your body is not fully developed until you're in your mid-20s, right? Like you are not fully grown, right, until you are in your mid-20s. This is what science has said. In which case, that drinking alcohol on an underdeveloped liver at 15 or 16 or whatever, especially if you were to drink significant amounts of alcohol, if you were to binge drink, can have drastic consequences later on in life. Okay? So the government discriminates there, but the government has found that it has just cause to discriminate. And age-based discrimination is the most common form of sort of discrimination that we have under the 14th Amendment that the government is allowed to engage in. So this is it for right now. This is our little intro. It went a little bit longer than what I wanted. But we're going to get into civil rights and civil liberties, and we're going to spend almost 3 weeks on this, I believe. We're going to lose a day for the PSAT and some stuff like that. But we're going to spend a significant amount of time on this issue, this unit, because civil rights and civil liberties are so important to them. Thank you.